I think that America and more broadly the entire world have been going through a lot of economic changes over the last 20 to 30 years or so. And a lot of problems have come from that. And I think that right and left-wing Americans actually have a consensus point where they can identify what problems are being caused, but their ability to understand what is causing these problems is where things really, really go off the rails. First things first, I'll be honest, I have a bias. I'm a pretty left-wing person, if you haven't been able to tell following me for however long you have. So I think I can give the perspective from the left wing, but it is going to inform my own biases, how I address what I think is the right-wing perspective on issues that are facing America and broadly the world today. So just keep that in mind if I come off like completely partisan here, because I probably will. Now, the left-wing perspective, or let's be honest, this is just my perspective as someone who's left-wing, is that deregulation, kicking off in the 1980s with Reagan and the neoliberal revolution that continued with Clinton in the 90s and up into the 2000s and to like roughly today, that period of deregulation let corporations become far too large and far too powerful of a faction in just broader society. This freeing of the global markets, as understood by Reagan, Thatcher, this was all predicated on the idea that if you let companies operate with more freedom, they will do more for society. It's a very big oversimplification, but it's kind of the basics of it. Now, whether it was a crime of ignorance or of like actual intent, corporations, when they were let free, just kept increasing their power, their influence, their revenue, to the point at which they started influencing politics and society broadly in particularly heinous ways, to the point at which like this idea of like corporatist and like bought off politicians sort of became the norm. The idea that you would want to restrict the economy or introduce new regulations became a socialist idea. And both political parties in the United States became parties that just accepted, oh yeah, corporations have this degree of power and it's not going to go back at all. So a very broad left-wing explanation for why there's decline, as it were, is that these companies become so powerful they can influence politicians to lower taxes, invest less in public infrastructure, and then subsequently those corporations can then move American jobs, American middle-class jobs, over to China or to Southeast Asia, where they can just maximize profit at the expense of the American people. And that's what explains everything. The reason that there is a housing crisis and properties keep going up is because corporations buy homes and use them as investments rather than people buying them and using them as homes. The reason that college is so expensive is because it's become socially ingrained that you have to go there, so corporations that have investments here want those tuitions to go up. The reasons that Americans aren't having children is because corporations have gotten rid of their reliable jobs in exchange for lesser paying gig economy jobs, and subsequently people cannot afford to have children. So to summarize, corporations with too much power, paying off politicians, making the economy as beneficial to them as possible, and maximizing profit at the expense of the actual people themselves. This is where my bias is going to come out, because my understanding of the right-wing perspective is that they can see these issues happening. They're very, very aware of these issues happening. But a core tenet of being conservative is a belief in like capitalism and the economic system that's gotten us to where we are. So you can't attack capitalism directly and propose that, oh, all these issues are a problem because this is just what happens when basically the leash gets taken off and capitalism runs rampant. That isn't something that's acceptable broadly to a conservative perspective. What conservatism seems to have done in like the last 2 decades in response to all these issues that are arising is use words like globalist or like cultural Marxists. This broad idea that there's nothing wrong with capitalism itself, but that there is a class of people that is profoundly evil and with malicious intent is rigging things behind the scenes purely to maximize their own power at the expense of regular people. Now, those are very, very similar perspectives, as it were. It's like this broad criticism of people that have power, but very different perspectives on like where that power is. Where left-wing people will like talk about like specific companies or specific like entities that are an issue. You'll have something where like people on the right will be like, oh, this is a problem that's being caused in part by like the UN, a powerless globalist organization that is like maliciously attacking people. the core difference that exists between these perspectives is that left-wing people believe this is just what happens when capitalism functions without regulation, whereas right-wing people think that this is a corruption of capitalism and that there is someone not just operating as they would in this system, like any capitalist would, but that there are legitimately malicious people that want to do damage. The biggest example is probably like something like QAnon. It's like, it can't be markets that are doing this. It has to be like a cult of baby-eating pedophiles hiding in the basement of a pizzeria. Trump tapped into this a lot earlier than the Democrats did, and you can see like his whole thing, like drain the swamp, that there's a deep state, there's a cabal of people behind the scenes that are ruining capitalism and hurting people. And Hillary Clinton did not accept that premise, as it were. She just functioned as normal. And I think a big part of why she lost was that working people, looking for any solution really, found Donald Trump palatable if it meant actually making things work again. But of course, Trump didn't destroy or uncover a collective of evil demon worshippers controlling the deep state. And I feel like Democrats have finally sort of caught up to it. Bernie Sanders was the start, but now I think a pick like Tim Walz kind of shows that the Democrats are like, okay, we really need to start incorporating working people again. And we even noticed that with like the CHIPS Act that Biden passed, this idea that like he wanted to bring manufacturing back because it got to the point where people were so upset with the state of how the economy was progressing towards this increasing corporate power that you have to start moving stuff back here and actually giving Americans some of that power that was ceded to corporations 30, 40 years ago. So that's the pitch being made from either side, is that like these issues that are real, that we can all see exist, the Democratic perspective, the Harris perspective being the one that Joe Biden held, which is we will start reining in corporate power somewhat, freeing you from unnecessary and stupid debt, and just trying to get like manufacturing here so that people have more say in the economy. Whereas the Trump perspective is, I'll get them. Them being whatever nefarious, evil collective you choose to believe is controlling the global economy behind the scenes and is with like vile, horrid intent hurting people. The positive you can take from this is that even if, like myself, you perceive one of the perspectives as just wishful fantasy, is that this is what people are running on now. The ability to fix 40 years of deregulation and the effect it has had on broader society is now what people care about. Trump seemed to be the breaking point that made left-wing politicians realize we have to give something back at this point. So regardless of who wins, this is still going to be the issue for years to come.